Let's continue filling in our structure list. The last thing that we talked about was the occipital bone and the structures underneath it. So let's move on to the sphenoid bone, one of my favorite bones, because I like to call it the bat bone, because it literally looks like a bat. And this bat actually has wings. Notice it has greater wings and lesser wings. So let's look at a sphenoid bone, and then we'll fill in these parts. And then when we're done, we'll go to the ethmoid bone, and then we will go through and we'll talk about all the little holes, the foramen, the canals, and the meatus that we find in all of these bones. We can see the sphenoid bone from several perspectives. One of the best perspectives is taking the calvarium, the skull cap off where the brain would be sitting, and looking at this purple bone here in this picture. So notice we can see it from this perspective. If we again look into the skull, there's certain structures we can only see here. We can only see what's called the lesser wings here. Then the other perspective that we want to look at is again this kind of purple area here, if we're looking from an inferior perspective of the skull. And this structure right here, these are called pterygoid processes. They're actually protruding back at you, which is kind of hard to tell from a two-dimensional picture, but you have to understand the shadowing in the picture. Then this area out through here that actually runs up the side of the skull, this area running out through here up the side of the skull, that's going to literally be the greater wings. And we see the greater wings also in this region right here and this region right here. Now let's look at one more perspective. Okay, from the side of the skull, this is the greater wing of the sphenoid out through here, and that's part of the pterygoid process, is what I like to call the bat's feet, right through here. So obviously it's got all these other bones around it, so you kind of have to know what perspective am I looking at this from. Here we see an individual bone of the sphenoid just by itself, and we can again see our greater wings out through here, out through here. We can see the lesser wings right through here and here. So notice that it has lesser wings, but it's this area here all the way out through here. Then we can also see there's a depression in here. So there is a saddle-like area with a depression in it. The saddle-like area with a depression in it is called the sella turcica, which just basically means Turkish saddle. Okay, then we have what I call the bat's feet, the pterygoid processes. Now, if we were looking down, we'd taken the skull cap off, we would be looking down on it this direction, so we would only see these features. But if we were looking underneath the skull from this direction, then we would be able to see the pterygoid processes, but we wouldn't be able to see the lesser wings. So again, kind of understanding how this fits in the skull is important. Again, using our mastering AMP, we can see the individual parts of the sphenoid bone, and we can click on the
greater wing, pterygoid process, lesser wing.
Okay, so there are several different perspectives we can see from this. This is a great perspective where it actually goes into some of the foramen and holes, the canals and everything. But what I want to show you right now is actually the Turkish saddle, which is this little indention right here.
Sella turcica.
Sella turcica, or I've heard it pronounced turcica, so that's how I learned it, that's how I say it, but either way is correct. Okay, then you've got the different foramen that you can see. Again, you can see the greater wing, you can see the lesser wing area from this perspective.
Lesser wing.
Okay, if I can see that the lesser wing kind of goes near the sella turcica or turcica. So I can't overemphasize, since you don't have models, how important it is for you to get on the Mastering AMP site and look at these structures, especially looking for the terms that are on your structure sheet, because that's what I will test you from. So hopefully you are able to tell the greater wings and the lesser wings and the pterygoid processes. Pterygoid processes being what I call the bat's feet. The sella turcica, the Turkish saddle, actually the bone part is the sella turcica, but the space that's formed is called the hypophyseal fossa. Fossa basically means a depression. Hypophyseal refers to the fact that the pituitary is often called the hypophysis. So this depression is where the pituitary gland fits around or way your skull fits around your pituitary gland as it hangs off of your brain. Okay, now the superior orbital fissure is actually in the eye socket region. So let's look at that real quick. So if we were looking into the orbital of the eye, straighten this up, and this purple bone back here is the sphenoid bone, but as I looked, because it forms the rear of the orbital, here's the frontal bone forming the top of the orbital and part of the rear of the orbital, but the sphenoid forms most of the rear of the orbital of the eye. Notice I've got the split right here and the split right there, and that is the superior orbital fissure, because we actually have an inferior orbital fissure, which is a lower split, this lower split. Now, that's not on your list, but I want you to deduce that from the fact that it is a fissure, a split, and that's a fissure, a split. This is superior, it's in the orbital. This is inferior in the orbital. So sometimes I don't give you every word that I could with the expectation that you would be able to figure that out if you know the one that I've given you. Okay, let's look at that from a slightly different perspective. So if I'm looking into the orbital of a skull, notice the big split right here. The big split right there, superior orbital fissure, that's actually in the sphenoid bone. There's the inferior orbital fissure right there. It's hard to see it from the angle on this one, even though it is on both sides. So that's split in the back of the orbital, superior orbital fissure. Here we see the sphenoid again, and notice there's the lesser wing, and going up through here is the greater wing. And right underneath the lesser wing, that split that we see right there is the superior orbital fissure. So it is formed by basically by the lesser wing. Again, looking at the backbone, the sphenoid bone from here, notice here's our greater wing, lesser wing, and then that split right there is the superior orbital fissure. Okay, our next bone we want to look at is the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is a really uniquely shaped, kind of almost like a little block, a little cube shaped bone with several parts on it that we want to understand. And we can literally see this bone from several different perspectives, kind of like, we can see the sphenoid from several different perspectives. Okay, so the ethmoid, we can see kind of looking up through the nasal area. We can see it looking through the orbital area, which is the eye area. We can see it looking down if we've taken the calvarium or skull cap off. So let's look at it from those different perspectives and see what parts we can see on the ethmoid bone if we do that. Let's start out by looking for the lateral masses, which is what we would see if we look into the orbitals of the eyes. In this picture, the orbital of the eye is going to be here, partly made up of the cranial bones, partly made up of the facial bones, but the side of the ethmoid bone is the lateral mass. Now, maybe a better way of looking at that is saying here's part of the ethmoid bone, so this side that I can see through the orbitals is the lateral mass. Again, looking into the orbital where it says ethmoid, well, this portion of the ethmoid is the lateral mass, so I would have it on each side. I'd have one of the lateral masses on, in this case, the right eye, the other on the other side, the left eye. Okay, so here, even though this would be looking through the nose, so this is kind of a if the eyes were right around here looking upward and we were looking through the nose this direction, then this would be in the orbital area. So this kind of flat, broad area right here is the lateral mass. The rest of this would be covered up, except we would, looking through here, we would look through the nose region to see these portions, but this we would have to see looking down through the calvarium region. So we will look at that. So again, on this, the lateral mass is over here to this side, and the other one would be this. You're seeing kind of the top edge of it over here. So these are definitely turned at different angles of each other. Okay, the next two parts let's look at are the cristagalli and the cribriform plates, which can only be seen if we've taken the skull cap off and looking straight down, because the brain sits over these two parts. So let's look at those. So notice this perspective where we've removed the skull cap, the calvarium. The brain actually sits right in this area. Now, this is the frontal bone right through here, but this green bone is the ethmoid bone, at least the part we can see. And what else we can see on the ethmoid from this perspective is there's a ridge that runs over the kind of in the middle of it called the crista galli, and then on either side there are the sides, the small sides of this bone that have little pit marks in them called olfactory foramina, and these are called the cribriform plates. So this area here with the little holes in it is the cribriform plates. Now this is important because these little holes is where olfactory nerves come up and actually stimulate what's called the olfactory bulb on the frontal lobe of the brain. We'll be talking about that when we get to the brain, so I'll be referring back to this. So this crista galli kind of sits in a fissure between the two hemispheres, and then the bulbs kind of from on the frontal lobe of the brain kind of fit over this, and because of course smell is coming in through the nasal region, and then the nerves are running up through those little pit marks on the cribriform plates. So our ethmoid bone would be sitting right through here. Again, there's our lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. There's our sella turcica. So the ethmoid would be surrounded by the frontal bone right here. There would be a ridge running right here. That'd be the crista galli. And then little areas beside the ridge, little depressions beside the ridge with little holes in it, that would be the cribriform plates. Okay, holding the ethmoid bone from the side, here's the ridge, the crista galli. So on either side of that ridge would be little depressions here, little holes running in it, the cribriform plates. And then I know this isn't the greatest picture in the world, but what we can see is this right here is, you can kind of see the crista galli, the ridge right here, and you can see the depression right here with little holes in it. That'd be the cribriform plates. Now, this big hole here is actually a sinus. It's not the little olfactory foramina that we see in here. We'll talk about sinuses later. Okay, here's another perspective. Again, you can see the ridge right there, the crista galli. You can see a little depression right here and right here. It's hard to see little pit marks in there. Plus, these are models, so they don't show it completely accurately. But the little pit marks, so there's the cribriform plate on either side of the crista galli. Now, again, these big holes are actually sinuses or space inside a bone. These would be ethmoid sinuses. But what we're talking about right now is this depression, and that ridge. And this is looking down on top of it. The brain would fit over top of this. Okay, so what we're going to look at now is we're going to look at something called a perpendicular plate, and then we're going to look at the superior and middle nasal conchae, also called turbinates. Okay, keep in mind we are still looking at the ethmoid bone, okay? And there's a ridge that runs through the middle of the ethmoid bone, and actually the vomer, that slender, sharp bone, and there the bottom portion of the nasal region kind of connects to that ridge. But this ridge runs right down the middle of the anterior portion where we're looking into the actual nasal region. This little ridge is called the perpendicular plate. Now, coming off of that, now remember we already talked about inferior nasal concha, which are literally bones themselves. But if we have an inferior something, that's usually because we have a superior and maybe even a middle. So what we would have here, we have a middle nasal concha, which is actually part of the ethmoid bone. And behind the nasal region, which you can't see in this picture because it's literally behind us, but if we were to tilt the head up and we could see underneath the nasal bones, then we would see the superior nasal conchae. So what we're going to look at, so again, if we look at the perpendicular plate, the middle ridge, the upper areas coming off of it are the superior nasal conchae. The lower areas at the bottom, if we're looking straight into it, are the middle nasal conchae, and they're thicker. Okay, here's a good perspective. Even though superior is up this way, inferior is down this way. Here is actually the perpendicular plate. You can see how it's a ridge running in the middle. You can see how the superior nasal conchae kind of jut out from it to the side, but the middle nasal conchae, which are lower, even though it's kind of like turned upside down on this picture, the middle nasal conchae are thicker. And we have to keep in mind that the ethmoid bone would lie here with the inferior nasal conchae below it. So we'd have inferior nasal conchae, middle nasal conchae, and then upper would be the superior nasal conchae.